Welcome back for the last session of JLF New York 2020, which is also the last session of JLF in the United States of America, because we now move on to JLF at Toronto in Canada next weekend. On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts in association with the Asia Society New York, we welcome you to this fabulous concluding session. Elegy to Epic, Reimagining the Landscape of Poetry, Vijay Seshadri and Ranjit Hoskote in conversation with Sampurna Chattarji. Three poets cast an eye on the changing landscape of words. Pulitzer Prize winner Vijay Seshadri's latest book of poems, That Was Now, This Is Then, is a mesmerizing paradox of time and space which upends traditional notions of lyrics and elegies. Celebrated cultural theorist and poet Ranjit Hoskote's latest book of poems, The Atlas of Lost Beliefs, is a three-part epic which engages with the histories of the sea, with the lives and afterlives of empire, colonialism, slavery, exploration, and the unpredictable transregional encounters among languages. In conversation with poet and translator Sampurna Chattarji, they read from their work and speak of the sources, inspirations, contexts, and philosophy of their poetic imagination. What better way than to conclude JLF in the United States? Vijay Seshadri is the author of the poetry book Wild Kingdom, The Long Meadow, The Disappearances, 3 sections, and That Was Now, This Is Then, as well as many essays, reviews, and memoir fragments. His work has been widely recognized and anthologized and recognized with a number of honors, among them the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Ranjit Hoskote is a poet, cultural theorist, and curator. His 6 collections of poetry, including Vanishing Acts, Central Time, and Jona Wale, his translation of a celebrated 14th century Kashmiri woman saint's poetry, has appeared as Ai Lala, the poems of Lal Ded. Hoskote has curated India's first ever national pavilion at the Venice Biennale under the title Everyone Agrees It's About to Explode. Sampurna Chattarji is a writer, translator, and teacher, as well as the poetry editor of the Indian Quarterly. Her 18 books include 8 poetry titles, the most recent being Space Gulliver, Chronicles of an Alien, Over and Underground in Mumbai and Paris. Her translations of Joy Goswami's selected poems is a Harper perennial, and Wordy Gurdy Boom, her translation of Sukumar Ray, is a Puffin classic. Her new translation of Joy Goswami's prose poems, After Death Comes Water, is forthcoming. This conversation will be followed by Q&A, so please do feel to send in your questions by writing it into the comment section, and we will send these to Sampurna to ask of our speakers. To remember, all our sessions, including the previous ones from all of the JLFs in North America, JLF Boulder, Colorado, JLF Houston, and of course JLF New York, is available on Facebook and YouTube channels. These are JLF Litfest and JLF Litfest, Jaipur Litfest.jlf. In these unusually difficult times, and it has been very difficult, we really struggled to bring together JLF across North America and all of the JLF series that we're doing without charging a registration fee. If you can, please do donate generously as you can, so that we can ensure a free flow of knowledge and information across the world. It's one way of being able to push back on the narrative of hatred and the narrative where facts don't matter. So please do help if you can. You can donate to us on our website, jlflitfest.org/New York. Ladies and gentlemen, Elegy to Epic, Reimagining the Landscape of Poetry. Sampurna, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy, for the introduction, and a very warm welcome to Vijay and Ranjit, poets whose work I have read intensively, closely, poets whose work I admire as a practitioner and return to as a reader repeatedly. So it is for me a very great privilege as well as a pleasure to be engaging you both in conversation today. I have been reading the books that we will be talking about in particular, and what struck me as I read and reread is very often, despite your the different styles and the different vantage points from which you approach your material and your universes, I was very struck and often very moved by the convergences of your concerns. And this oceanic depth and breadth of your exploration. And this is a question that I want to begin our conversation with. Novelists are very often asked this dreaded question, what is your book about? But I would like to turn that around and ask the two poets here who are with me today the question, where does it come from? What is the wellspring of what I like to think of and as a shared taxonomic, almost cerebral interest that you both have in the world, in, dare I say, all its manifestations? Because as I uh, read your new book and revisit your old ones, I can see the connective tissues between them. So could we start the beginning by going to the beginning? What is the source? Ranjit, in one of your poems, you offer the opening. The source is the pause. So, what would you care to elaborate?
Where does it come from? Let me begin more formally by thanking the JLF for this marvelous occasion where we may speak about our work and the things that bring us together and that keep us going in the world. And it's marvelous to share the platform with Vijay and Sampurna this evening. Where does it come from is, I think, just a very compelling curiosity about the world, an encyclopedic, sometimes a scary encyclopedic interest in the world. I think that's the beginning, and I don't believe that any particular form has a monopoly on that. I've had this experience with a dear friend who's a novelist also. I remember a time when it took a few years for me to work on what ultimately was a rather well-contained poem on Ghalib and Mughal Delhi. And I happened to tell my friend, Ilya Troyanov, the novelist, that I'd been researching for a poem. And he fell about in laughter, saying, that's what we do, we novelists. Why would a poet want to research a poem? So I want to hold that thought in mind. I think there are many different forms of research, ranging from actual muddling about in the archives to osmosis to just keeping your eyes and ears open. Also to very contrary histories, the contrary histories that go into the making of who we are. And that is an open question. Who are we? We are threatened today by sources and forces of authority that want to tell us who we are. But there's something within us that resists that seeks the heterogeneous, the contrary, the hybrid. For me, that's where it comes from.
Vijay, could I turn the question to you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. First of all, I also want to say thank you to the Jaipur Lit Fest, and it's great to be here with you again, Ranjit. You and I, we share this sort of transcendental platform across Eastern and Western Hemisphere, and we always, this is how Ranjit and I meet, and it's good to be on a panel with you, Sampurna. About the question, specifically this book, the question should be asked where it didn't come from and where I wanted it to come from but couldn't make it come from. I wanted to write, after I'd finished my last book, poems that were abstractions in this sense, that they didn't participate in history, either personal history or political history. And I think that's the great luxury of America, or it used to be. And we have produced great ahistorical poets here, Wallace Stevens, John Ashbery, simply because of, the liberation from the exigencies of history. And And I always wanted to get to that place, and I never quite could. And this book of poems, these poems just wrote, are emphatically not ahistorical. They're driven by things that happened to me and things that happened to American society in the past 4 years in which the poems were written. And so I see this book as a defensive book, a kind of a resistance to the pressure of the things that were happening around me, the things that were happening to me, and the things that were happening to the country and to society. The sense of the dawn of the apocalypse I was always feeling, and so I guess it comes from a real historical unease, this book, and hopefully that's going to dissipate over time, and I'll be able to go back to trying to write abstractions.
Yes, because this is something that I have marked, this ability to locate oneself, as it were, in the historical present, the nowness of this moment, and yet to traverse back and forth with a significant amount of fluidity. So what I feel as I read both your new work is a simultaneous sense of being anchored and displaced. And I got the feeling persistently that just as you were trying to relocate yourself and recenter perhaps the way you saw the world, which was constantly in flux, there was also another deeper kind of shift and unbalancing. And I wonder whether that is to some extent reflected in your title. Here I'm thinking, of course, of the very interesting title, That Was Now, This Was Then, which immediately makes you, there's a slight faltering that it induces. And in Ranjit's The Atlas of Lost Belief, there is the title poem, in fact, in the title poem, it's a kind of gathering in which there's this Noah's Ark feeling where everything can be found. So would both of you like to respond to this idea of the shift, the unbalance, and also whether these disjunctions and disorientations, do you feel, have they always been key to your poetics, or is it really, as you said, the present, the unease that we are situated within, that emphasizes these disorientations?
Yeah. Should I start?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I put it to myself this way. When you're young, you write about space. And when you get old, you write about time. And because time, which is something that is not really apparent to the young, becomes more and more apparent. So when you get to a certain point, there is this phenomenon, right, which suddenly acquires greater and greater depth. I mean, when you're young, you're sort of living in time, you're living in the now in some way, and then the retrospective consciousness grows, and the retrospective consciousness is really sort of, I think, destabilizing in some way, and more I see the tension between temporality and atemporality. And this is very much a book about, my book is, really a book that was written in awareness of that, awareness of the movement of time, the passage of time, the mystery of time, And, and of course, the Indian god who most represents time, that mystery is Shiva, right? Is the most destabilizing of the deities of India. Yeah,
You have this line in one of the poems where you say the free person, the truly free from time, face the world, don't roll your eyes. And
Yeah.
I read that line out, and I can see why you would have to also say, don't roll your eyes, because the, the recipient of this poem is perhaps going to be tempted to do just that. But there is this profound appreciation of the passage of time through oneself. And I think that is quite beautifully captured in many of the poems. Ranjit, do you want to quickly respond to this before I maybe ask you to read a couple of poems?
Now, I was very struck by what Vijay said about the transition from space to time. And I must confess that since I've crossed 50, this is beginning to, the sense of time and mortality is beginning to play a huge role for me. And I'm thinking constantly of St. Augustine's marvelous image of the hymn, somewhere towards the end of the City of God. He says that when you begin to sing the hymn, you don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know how it's going to end. By the time you get to the middle of it, a certain sort of pattern is established, but you still don't know what's yet to come. It's only when you come to the end that the whole pattern is revealed to you in a strange way. So I think I'm at the point where I'm beginning to get a bit anxious about figuring out what the patterns have been and what they're likely to be. I feel that I'm at some kind of midpoint. So the book, The Atlas of Lost Beliefs, or Jonah Whale, as its Indian edition is called, is about seeking deeper patterns that are getting overlaid, patterns that have unfolded in time.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to call them histories, we might want to call them narratives. They've sunk out of sight, sometimes they've been erased, sometimes they're lost to us because they're in archives that we don't have access to. Sometimes they're in languages that we need to struggle with. So for me, the book also emerges as an act of retrieval. It's an act of retrieving these different temporalities that have gone into what I see as our present being. And this for me is also a political commitment, because we're now being asked to buy into some sense of a civilization that's never changed, an authentic, native history that has unfolded from the dawn of antiquity. And I want to retrieve all that is true of us in our experience, our language, in the food we eat, in the books we've read, the stories we've been told, that tells us that that is not how things were. So it's important for me to retrieve the 18th and 19th century histories of the sea, the different languages, to go into music and retrieve these things. In the end, for me, it's a kind of modest take on some sort of Gesamtkunstwerk. In what way can I open up the body of the singular poem, which is still close enough to the lyric, to something more polyphonic, something more choric, something more polyglot? How do I bring multitudes into the lyric? These are driving questions for me in this book.
And I think there's a point where you say, you talk about the light and the lyric self burning up on re-entry. And I think it is the image of a swimmer who emerges back into the air and the lungs are burning. And there's something of the pain of the transitions between different stages. And it makes me want to ask you, Vijay, when we talk of cities, we talk of sources, we talk of time. In this book, could one say that grief could also be a powerful source to begin with? Not so much a disabling force as as a force that one could tap for something that in your poem, this poem that I really love, called Colin's Ferry Landing, which is your elegy for your father. And it struck me that grief then becomes the starting point in this elegy for really what is an epic journey, because it is a retracing, it's a going back into memory, it's a re-inhabiting. So would that at all be an appropriate observation?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but grief, I guess, to go back to what you referred to with Ranjit's poem, grief lyricized, and, devotion lyricized is a hymn, grief lyricized is an elegy, and it is a kind of memorialization, right? It's ritualization. I mean, at the beginning of the middle section of the book, there's a poem to my mother that I was writing to her when she was alive. I was the primary caregiver of both my parents, and that seemed appropriate because she was sort of she was a creature who was full of life, and I could never really imagine writing an elegy for her because she was such a powerful force. I mean, you could set her on a desert island, and in 6 months she would have created a civilization. She was that kind of person, you know. My mother, my father, my sister, and I were just sort of ordinary people, you know. So for him, I think it was appropriate that I write an elegy, and that elegy is very, very historical. It's not only my history with him and his history with me, but his history with India. You know, it's like, you know, the one place, that central prose section in that elegy is kind of, you know, I was very conscious of making the spine of that prose section the arc of his journey from India to America, and sort of using that, what Ranjit was calling those histories, you know, that might come from the 19th century, but this one came from the 20th century. But it was a history of migration, and it was kind of, you know, important for me to put it in that historical context, even though it's not emphasized. It's definitely alluded to and is sort of there. And so in some sense, he takes in an arc of time that is, you know, the history of India, the history of America, the history of the diaspora, their relationship to one another. And
in fact, I think in that arc of time, the scope of it feels epic. It's a compression. It's a constructed as a marvelous compression, but the scope feels epic. And I want to bring this up because, you know, the idea that here are these received forms, however we understand and receive them, where in particularly that central section of Collins Ferry Landing, compression achieves an epic effect. And when I think of Ranjit's poem After the Story, Ranjit, which you did write in memoriam of your mother after her passing, and in that what you do is you the elegiac enters your retelling of the epic, that is the Ramayana. So I've been thinking about the ways in which, what do you take from the received forms and how do you remake them so movingly as you do? That is, of course, the one thing that I would put out here. And very importantly, I would love our audiences also to hear these two sections. This seems to be the right moment to do that. So if you'd like to quickly answer the question or not, read the poem as the answer in itself, would love to hear them both.
Mm-hmm. Vijay, should I go first?
Yeah, why don't you go first? Or should I go first? What do you want to do?
Why don't you go first?
Okay. So this poem is in 3 sections, and it's an elegy to my father, and I guess I should say something about him. He was born in Bangalore, and in the late 40s, he got a master's in physics there, and he wanted to go out into the big world, into, you know, he wanted to pursue science. That was at the, you know, the beginning of the Indian Republic, and of course, as you all know, Nehru had invested a lot of money in Bangalore, and so had the Tatas with the Tata Institute, and they were doing physics of a highly sophisticated sort there. And my father, he wanted to do that too, but he was responsible for the care of his mother and a couple of his sisters, one of whom was unmarried and another of whom had lost her husband. So, and he was offered a fellowship at the Tata Institute but he couldn't take it. He had to go teach at colleges in the interior of Karnataka. because the money for the fellowship couldn't have supported his family. So he missed his first opportunity, but he was determined to be a scientist on the world stage. And after I was born in 1954. In 1955, he came to America to get his PhD. And this central section is a section of prose about him, and it's framed in the form of a kind of I'm telling him a story about something that happened right after he died. And not all three sections of the poem are addressed to him. I'm talking to him in all three. Okay, and this is the second section, and it's in prose. I have a friend, you'll be glad to know. She and I work together. You'll be glad to know I still have a job. She's an ally. She's sympathetic. She's warm-hearted. She's socially conscious, gentle, a decent type, and from what I've observed, an excellent mother, too. Not very smart, though. A little while after your soundless departure, I was telling her about you. I was describing what I saw as your place, yes, your highly functional place, on the spectrum of, what are the right words? Neurocognitive homelessness? I was describing cultures of shame evolving across millennia, economies of scarcity versus economies of surplus, civilizations teetering on the edge of time, about to take the plunge into oblivion. Deep India, I said to her. Wonders and terrors, I said to her. Deep India, strewn with elephants and cobras, scorched by temples, mosques, stupas, churches, synagogues, cratered with poverty, hunger and thirst, storms of affliction, shot through with sacred rivers. They flood, they shrivel out. The sun's furious particle stream immerses the pencil-thin scavengers picking sustenance from the dry riverbeds. The infant God opens his mouth to display the entire, appalling universe. I told her that long ago, when the earth was still flat, you made your pinched, solitary tramp freighter journey from there to here. Colombo, Suez, across the Middle Sea, then over the far edge. I was talking privation. I was talking history and injustice. I was getting wound up and indignant. That was what must have triggered her inimitable gift for this sentimental non sequitur. She put her right hand on my left arm and said, "He'll always be with you, in your heart." See what I mean? See what I mean? Not if she had said one bright morning we'd meet up again in heaven. And I wouldn't put it past her to say something like that, too. Would she have made me angrier? I could have kicked her shin. But, wait, don't interrupt. And no, of course I didn't kick her shin. I'd like to explain why I kept talking to her in the aftermath of her idiotic outburst. Why I didn't shake the dust of my feet off at her and cut her off then and there forever. Though the time in which I'm writing this overlaps yours, you'd be amazed and embarrassed if you understood the extent to which we're allowed these days, encouraged even, to indulge feelings and succumb to motives and express resentments and make demands offensive to reason, that a mind with an experience like yours, a burden of discipline, a resignation and a silence like yours, a mind like yours cowled by melancholy, would consider disreputable, even shocking. I'm sad to say you won't be surprised that I've been taken advantage of this license. I've indulged openly and shamelessly, and also secretly, more times than I'm willing to remember. But I want you to understand that at this moment my talking was anything but self-indulgent. I was confused in the weeks after you died, and my confusion didn't derive from the universal fact that a parent's death is too strangely shaped for a child of theirs to grasp with any confidence, but from the fact that I myself was becoming strangely shaped. I was crying, bawling at times, and grieving in the way I imagine I was expected to, in conformity with generally accepted principles of grief. But also, don't get judgmental, I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in this. I wasn't just feeling grief, but congratulating myself for it. I was seeing myself as the star of my loss, its protagonist, treading the boards, pacing under the proscenium arch of bereavement. Some part of me was saying, finally, reality, I've heard so much about it. That wasn't the real strangeness, though. It was this sin of self-awareness, this dramatization of the self, this consequentiality of consciousness, this aestheticization, this the most pathetic of all the assertions of the self as it stumbles across its blasted heath of existence, was leading to a separation of self from self that was making apparent another person underneath. Another person suddenly arrived inside me. Another person, as real as the person typing this, but detached, outside the world itself and growing huge in relation to it. Another person was standing at the crossroads of time and space, shirtless, shoeless, but dressed in a nice suit, on the outside looking in, curious but indifferent to being and not being, both of which he understood as accidental and impossible. The free person, the truly free, free from time, space, the world. Don't roll your eyes, this was actually happening. Cool and supercilious before a million universes, Whitman says, or something like that. In the years when you were angry with me and frightened for me, the search for this person haunted my mind. But now that I was he was the last person I wanted to be. The distance I suddenly had achieved wasn't joyous, it was unendurable. This is why I kept talking and talking whenever I could, climbing hand over hand up the rope of words to get back to my ordinary, unenlightened life. I was clinging to other people with words. I was gripping them by their lapels. I couldn't let them go. The knowledge I had I didn't want. I knew, though, probably for the first time in my life what I did want. I wanted the details. I wanted to be sitting on the living room couch, watching Jeopardy with you.
Thank you, Vijay. It's just very moving to hear you read that. I won't spoil it with any comments afterwards. Ranjit, could I ask you to read after the story?
Oh, well, thank you. This is, in fact, an elegy for my mother. And when I think back, so much that I received by way of a liberal education really came from my parents at home, well before and alongside school and college. And it was a household and a family where there was a great plurality of cultural references. And I think my parents also belonged to that generation where received and inherited spiritual traditions were set over against a Nehruvian temperament. So this idea that one could be critical and yet empathetic towards received traditions was part and parcel of how they were and how I was brought up. So this retelling of the Ramayana, if you will, after the story, is it really pivots around many conversations with my mother, where from childhood on, whenever she told me stories from the epics, alongside came also a certain sort of subtle commentary about how we were to see these stories by the light of our modern consciousness. So Ram was a figure who fascinated my mother, and she was very critical of him when she did not hold him up to be the measure of human conduct as we are now told he should be. And She was particularly critical of his what we would now gloss as his patriarchal attitudes. So that's what After the Story looks at. And After the Story, the title is also a reference to Uttara Ramayana, the text of what happens after the seemingly happy ending of the epic. And it goes like this. From the anthill came the voice. Two white birds perched on a branch, one killed by a hunter's arrow. The first poem written in its blood, the morning sage's sudden curse, falls on the hunter's ear as verse. From the anthill came the voice. Prisoner on the island of his suspicions, alone under his white silk canopy, he murmurs the chants that his aging priests heap on the fire sacrifice. Then, from nowhere, two boys' voices, high flutes above the drone, dropped masks, startled faces. The boys sing. From the anthill came the voice of the golden deer in the forest, the princess carried off by the demon chief, the war, the siege, the giant red monkey caught wheeling across the sky and burning the island fortress. When the war ends, the prince fixes his wife's 14-year wait with a cold stare and an ordeal by fire. The fire plays honest witness. From the anthill came the voice, but the prince cannot bridge a distance greater than the stormy sea. Doubt again for him, again exile for her. Love twisted and beaten on a washerman's stone. At last she will have had enough of his tests. She will ask the furrowed earth to swallow her. He stands up shaking, his eyes opened wide, as his children sing to the king his own story.
Thank you, Ranjit and Vijay, for those moving renditions. And I think, this idea, two very powerful ideas actually emerge from these readings. One is this notion of neurocognitive homelessness, which is this phrase that leaps out at me from Vijay's piece. And Ranjit, what you it's almost like as if is the poet's task as we negotiate this very uh, complex and turbulent terrain that is maybe our inheritance, maybe, as you say, cultural reference that we regard with a certain critical eye. Uh, would these be ways of making our inscribing creation myths of our own? Would you, because somewhere when I read your poems and I feel, this is something that I found from an essay, a very short essay I wrote years ago, Vijay, when reading your book, The Disappearances, when it had been released in India. And it's interesting how closely that reading still applies to so many of the concerns in the new work, where I wrote Vijay Seshadri is as attracted by the crapulous city as he is by the ecological, the evolutionary, the way the cryptic terrain of any geographical space is a product of millions of years. And the fact that, um, the mutability of landscapes and the power of the human mind to reimagine them. So this is something that I want to put to you both. This recurrence of concerns. What kind of baggage do we carry, if we call it baggage? What is the trail or the trace that we carry from book to book? And in what way is this idea where the self regarding the self somehow seems to also be working rather powerfully here? So, would any of you like to pick up on any of these thoughts that I've just shared? Uh, because I keep getting this feeling that the lyric self is no longer constricted by the singularity
No.
that once constituted that idea. And there is an embodiedness that could move from thing to thing, from human to animal, animal to landscape. Um, it could be a river coursing through your veins, as you say, Ranjit, or as Vijay puts it in one of his poems. Today is the day the self whispering to herself in its 100 endangered languages
Mm.
merges with the sound of water running. So, I feel that there is this great desire to overcome these separations.
Mhm.
I'll just respond briefly to this. It's a marvelous question, and I think it speaks to both our practices in very particular ways. For me, again, a stray anecdote. From time to time, there are people who write about one's work, or for their sins, they suddenly find that one of my poems has appeared on their university syllabus, so they call up in alarm to to ask me what it's all about. And repeatedly, I find that for some reason, maybe those of us who happen to be poets and live in Bombay, we all have to carry this burden of being city poets who are alienated. So I had to tell one of these earnest students that I had never quite thought of myself as a city poet. I was a bit polemical, and I said, if anything, I see myself as a nature poet. I'm farmer. I mean, I was born in Bombay, but I spent my childhood in Goa, in a house on a hill surrounded by forest and bamboo grove. So from those early experiences and memories onwards, I'm far more at home with the larger ecology. So, and it came out like that. But when I thought about it, I think it's actually quite true. And with increasing force for me in the last few years, it's it's a convergence of the other writing that I do and my other concerns in theory. We have too long seen ourselves through the optic of the Enlightenment as sovereign individual selves for whom creation is laid out like some kind of feast that we can exploit at will. And this is the attitude that has brought us to catastrophe today. So again, as if you will, it's an aesthetic and a political commitment. To me, poetry is the place where I speak of these things. I speak of how one is not an individual, but is actually seized of a individuality. What is it that connects us to the predicaments of other people? What is it that connects us to a planet that we've violated and the crises we've unleashed? These are the questions that, to me, as a nature poet, I would address today. So that's one way of kind of tangential way of addressing some of the questions you raised, I think, if that helps.
Thank you, Ranjit.
Yeah.
Vijay, would you respond to that before we open it up for audience questions? I see a fair number of those have come in.
Yeah. I mean, your question was so nutritious, and Ranjit's answer was so nutritious too, that I want to approach it from a different point of view, and just by telling you all the ways in which I've encountered Ranjit. I first met Ranjit through a kind of early video conferencing thing, through some sort of interchange between, the government of America and something they were doing in India. This must have been like 10, 12 years ago, even longer. And then I met him in Mumbai. And then I met him in London. And then I met him in Bangalore. And now I'm meeting him again here, and what does that imply for poetry, right? It implies a tremendous fragmentation of selves, a multiplicity of experiences that cannot be contained by, this goes back to the title of this talk, by the forms we have been using. The distress we all feel as poets is the distress that the forms are either too big or too small for the actual nature of our experiences, right? They're incommensurate in some way. So they're always struggling with this issue of form. For me, the issue of the self, the issue of politics, all of those things it has a formal dimension, which is the aspect of it that I, as a poet, have to work out. I can't really figure out. I was saying earlier that, this was a very defensive book. It was kind of, a response to things that were impinging on me in some way. And And I was glad that I had received forms that I could retreat to, that I could use as a kind of, a fortress in some way. And so, but now that that book is done, the issue of form remains, because that's the fundamental issue of the self. I mean,
Yes. And I think in these formal compressions and enlargements, you're also letting the reader in. And I think this is a good point for me to take one of the questions, in fact, which is a question on form. Deepika Sinha asked, this is a question for Vijay, and this struck me when I was reading the book. There are two poems. It's actually the same poem. It's meeting in brackets thick and meeting in brackets thin. I really like that because it's through thick and thin. And Deepika would like it if you said something in particular about these two poems.
Yeah, I mean, that goes to the heart of the formal issue, right? Because both of those poems are written in quote unquote free verse. And what struck me in writing them was the utter instability of free verse, that there are no shlokas, there are no, couplets, there isn't a zamin, right, as the Urdu poets say, that you can, play with, just like there is no longer a culture that we can sort of respond to. We're really all decentered and culturalists in some way, I mean, even if you're living in India and you're surrounded by manifestations of Indian civilization of its many different forms, there's an existential nostalgia to just be living there, just like Ranjit was talking about the Ramayana and, his mother's reaction to it, that there is a self-consciousness that intrudes, and that was kind of, those two poems were my recognition of that in fact, this form is as arbitrary as that form, and I'm absolutely undecided, and myself is undecidable in relationship to them, and the process of writing that poem, and I kept going back and forth for months, and I finally decided to put both versions in, because
I found that there was a delightful cheekiness to it as well. It's very cheeky. It's a wicked thing to do, and I really enjoyed seeing that in the middle of that landscape. Since we were talking about sensibilities and being embedded, are we deculturalized? Or there's a poem. There's a question from Shantanu Alex, who asks, and perhaps Ranjit, you might pick this up. How would you characterize the Indian sensibility in English? How is it different from the American sensibility?
I don't know that there is either an Indian or an American sensibility in English or any other language. I'm not going to presume to speak on the American situation. Vijay is, of course, I would defer to him.
Perhaps you could respond to the idea of the sensibility being defined by nationality. That to me strikes me as...
Nationality is a very recent construct.
Yes.
The nation state is a recent construct anywhere, not just India.
And also, I suspect there is a certain monolithic idea to this very idea, to the bracketing of these two words together.
That's a phantom we've fought against for a very long time, not only in English in India, but also in many other languages. It's a burden that no writer should have to carry, because we're not representatives of a nation state that somehow is set in stone and well defined. I mean, I would say actually that what makes this culture vibrant is the fact that it is constantly questioning itself. It's opening up in unpredictable directions. It exists in multiple tenses. So what we do here as citizens, as poets, as artists, as artisans, is really to draw on this plurality of sources and craft them as we will. So the idea that there's a single Indian sensibility in some a priori way articulating itself is, to me, completely meaningless.
Yeah.
Vijay, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I would agree with it, but I don't think I'd go as far as Ranjit, that, culture, when the question is put that way, what is the culture? It implies, something that is substantial there that can be sort of paraphrased, the culture is fatalistic, or the culture is this, and those generalizations always fall apart. If you think of culture not as substance, but as relation, how are different elements of human life and human thought related to one another? How are things composed in a larger landscape? And the thing that is the principle of their composition is the culture, in some sense. I mean, I tend to generalize about India being outside of it, but having an intimate relationship through my parents, right? And one of the things I would say, for example, that is a difference between, and both of you might want to object to this vociferously, and I'd be happy to hear your objections, but, I would say that in India, in my experience of it, the basic unit of the society is the family. In America, the basic unit of the society is the individual, and that, what that does, what that implies, can't really be sort of encompassed and paraphrased, but it has a huge, huge sort of impact. And you can certainly see it in the way in which leadership expresses itself in India, or the leadership expresses itself here. I mean, Donald Trump with I'll rip the mask off, and, I mean, that's really, I mean, I can't imagine someone like Trump in India. I can imagine, all sorts of sort of tyrannical figures, but no one like Trump. I mean, he is really such a product of America. Yeah. And I think those things are different in some curious way, but it's hard to figure out how that works itself into anything. It's incalculable in this strange way,
And I think it's really the incalculability of these, I dare not call them concepts, but rather things that we are constantly grappling with, which continues to propel us towards, towards writing these fragile things we call poems. I do believe we are almost out of time, which is something that I couldn't have imagined happening when we started off. The pressure of time, and there's so much I would have loved to talk about. There's so much that I hope readers who pick up your books will gain from their voyages into the landscapes that you conjure up. Uh, I want to end with perhaps just the thought that here we are in the age of this apocalypse, talking about transitory selves, talking about the relationship possible across cultures. And I just opened my copy of Jonah Whale, and here is a quote that prefaces the book from the Upanishads as it is, which says, "The great fish glides through the river, touching the near bank and the far. The self swims the currents of dream and waking." And I thought how lovely that here is this extremely uh, powerful way of saying that this moving self, this free self, is really what we mean when we say we imagine a landscape through words. It's a way of inscaping, really, and then putting it into concrete forms so that people can find their own landmarks in this new geography. So thank you both very much, Vijay and Ranjit,
Thank you
for your work and for your poetry. And I wish you all the best for the books. And over to you, Shonjoy.
Thank you so much, Sampurna. Thank you so much, Vijay Seshadri, Ranjit Hoskote. Such beautiful thoughts there that each one of you shared. And Vijay, as you said, it takes a village to bring up a child, and you see that difference between perhaps what we call as Eastern cultures and perhaps what we see as Western cultures. And as you all said, it's incalculable, the difference there. And of course, the whole idea of time, that again was just so marvelously touched upon, and elegies both to your father and to your mother. But in all of this, the one thing that we didn't hear was Sampurna reading from her poems. And perhaps I'm sure Suraj or somebody's going to jump up and scold us. But before they jump up, Sampurna, did you want to share a poem with us just to close?
I do. I didn't. I
Yeah,
hadn't planned it,
we
but
didn't hear your voice in all of
because we I have these two beautiful books. This is Vijay's three sections reissued in the keepsake poetry traditions, and I kept them as talismans near me, good luck charms. And of course, because Space Gulliver is part of it, maybe I can quickly open it at any page and hope it gives me something. I think I'll read this, um, which is from the cathedral poems in this three-dimensional book about my doppelganger. I did want to talk about doppelgangers, which uh, which are present in both your work. Space Gulliver was very much my doppelganger when I was in Canterbury writing this book. But while writing it, I also wrote about the cathedral, which was my coordinate in that unfamiliar geography. It helped to anchor me. And this is one of the cathedral poems. On this very day in 1723, Handel was appointed as royal composer, but he couldn't get paid because, as the document says, he was an alien. Did he arrive then playing a blue streak, landing on the square before the cathedral with a small, surprising joke?
Mm.
And because I felt so much of an alien in Canterbury, Space Gulliver is the chronicle of an alien. Here we are discussing the ways in which the separation of self from self need not be an alienation. Perhaps it's just good luck that this poem presented itself. Thank you, Sanjay, for
Thank
asking me
no,
to read.
thank you, the three of you. And much of what we try and do in JLF across the world is really what you all talked about. The multiple experiences, which is so difficult to contain in one or two or a few words. It spills out beyond the pages. And we can continue forever and ever, and we will still not be able to capture the thousands and millions and billions of different viewpoints, and that coexist and sit or stand together. And that truth or truths, or the multiplicity of truths, is really what makes this pursuit of knowledge and thought so exciting and so important. So thank you, all three of you, Vijay Seshadri, Ranjit Hoskote, Sampurna Chattarji, for bringing JLF USA to a close, to a happy close, because even as you all were speaking, it seems that Nevada has now formally signed over to President Biden, or President-elect Biden. So you do have a new president. So on that perhaps happy note, yes, it won't change a lot, but perhaps it'll send a word out that change is possible, and that all of us could possibly consider taking that additional breath. And we know that change happens only through knowledge and information. So thank you all for creating such a beautiful moment this evening. And thank you to all our audiences. You all have been stellar, catching session after session and really hanging in there with every session. Every time we look at the numbers and we look at the amount of time each of you have spent in listening to the session, it's remarkable, because I keep wondering, are people going to listen? But you guys have been listening. So thank you all so much. And thank you to Asia Society, our partners, Rachel, our dear friend for so many decades. Thank you for endorsing JLF New York for the past few years. A special thanks to the Ambassador of India in the United States, Excellency Taranjit Singh Sandhu, the Consul General of India in New York, Mr. Ranjit Jaiswal, and his colleagues. And I do hope all of you will tune in next weekend with JLF Toronto, Canada, November 27th to the 29th. Last year was a very successful inaugural edition of the festival in Toronto, and we hope that this continues. Thank you to all our filmmakers, historians, diplomats, mythologists, journalists, screenplay writers, Pulitzer Prize winners, Nobel laureates, and so much more. And we look forward to seeing you all, receiving you all. There are special tickets for the exclusively curated opening night in Toronto. The rest of the sessions are free. Please do log on to our website, jlflitfest.org/Toronto. See you next weekend. Till then, stay masked, stay safe, and most importantly, keep learning, enjoying knowledge and information.
All right.
I would call the Jaipur Literature Festival a living library, or perhaps even a library of life. Do join us as we share the excitement of ideas and of debate and dialogue, of the adventures of science, of the joys of poetry and music, the consolations of philosophy, the sense of literature and of life.
So much about the festival in India, the scale of it, the energy of it, and I just love the fact that there is this effort to bring it to other cities in the world.
It's a variety of topics. It's meaningful. I'm just excited. I'm feeling like I've learned a lot to think about, and I appreciate JLF coming here.
Going forward, it would be a very good thing to do for the community to have this event on an annual basis.
I think that when you hear so many different voices and perspectives about the South Asian diaspora and many other issues, you learn that there's a lot of history that you're not taught every day, and I think that that's important to bring in today's world.
I was actually really surprised by the camaraderie I experienced here and the way that people at JLF, both attendees and other panelists, seem to really connect profoundly to literature and care about it.
In 2020, our live version of JLF has been laid to waste because of COVID-19. However, nothing's going to stop us from coming in the way of bringing our writers and speakers to you in Boulder, Colorado, Houston, New York, and Toronto, Canada.
Teamwork Arts, bringing India to the world and the world to India through Indian art and culture for over 30 years. One of Teamwork Arts' signature events, the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, is the world's largest free festival of its kind. With daily interactive sessions, lively debate and dialogue, and international music performances every night, it's no wonder the festival attracts over 500,000 visitors a year. The Jaipur Bookmark, an international B2B event for the publishing industry, happens during the Z Jaipur Literature Festival and sees a confluence of publishers, writers, and literary agents. Teamwork Arts, producers of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, have taken the flavor of the festival to international shores with vibrant events in the UK, Australia, and the US. Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world with almost 12 festivals of India across continents in a stunning array in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature, and so much more. In each of these places, Teamwork Arts' colourful festivals of India are the high points of the annual cultural calendars. Be it Confluence in Australia, India by the Bay in Hong Kong, India by the Nile in Egypt, Iron India in Chicago, Shared History in South Africa, India in the Sunshine City in Zimbabwe, Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Kala Utsavam in Singapore, Sarang in South Korea, festivals in Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, Sweden. The list is dizzying. The Jazz India Circuit is an endeavour by Teamwork Arts to spread the word and sound of jazz across the country. The 2017-18 season, 4 festivals across 3 cities, featuring over 25 stellar artists from India and around the world, including Jojo Mayer and Nerve, drummer-singer Jameson Ross, and Dave Weckl, who collaborated with the talented Mohini Day. The Mahindra Kabira Festival celebrates the spirit, lyric and verse of the 15th century mystic poet Kabir in his birthplace, the historic city of Varanasi. Kabir's poetry is about inclusiveness. Mahindra Kabira brings to music lovers an unforgettable experience of listening to leading exponents of the classical Banaras Gharana and rich folk traditions of music on the legendary banks of the mighty river Ganges, along with sessions on art and literature, specially curated walks with famous local residents and delectable local cuisine. Sacred celebrates the spiritual through music and its ability to heal. International artists collaborate with world music exponents from India amongst the most incredible desert settings on the banks of the Pushkar Lake. Heritage walks, meditation, talks, and workshops are part of this weekend experience. Teamwork Arts so promotes and recognizes the best of Indian theatre through the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards. The Meta Week in Delhi is an enthralling showcase of the 10 best nominated plays shortlisted from numerous entries received from across the country and across languages. The Meta Lifetime Achievement Award has been presented to leading lights of India's theatre industry. For the young and the young at heart, the Ishara International Puppet Theatre Festival brings local and international performances to audiences across several Indian cities. While the Multi-City Kahani Festival features interactive storytelling sessions and workshops championing the power of imagination. Bollywood Love Story, a musical. Our international touring productions such as Bollywood Extravaganza and Flamenco India have sold out shows across Europe, Egypt, Russia and Spain. Expressions International Contemporary Dance Festival showcases Indian and international productions, bringing together several dance genres for Indian audiences. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit www.teamworkarts.com.